11:23 a.m., September 14, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Technical Sergeant Billy McCrae crouched beneath the starboard wing of a battle-scarred F-4F Wildcat, watching Lieutenant Frank Walsh prepare for a mission that would pit his slower, heavier fighter against 12 Japanese Zeros. The morning air tasted of aviation fuel and coral dust. Walsh had been shot down twice in the past month. Both times, he'd survived only because his wingmen saved him. Today, Walsh was flying alone. McCrae had been maintaining Wildcats for 14 months. He knew every bolt, every wire, every weakness in the aircraft. The F-4F was tough, reliable, heavily armed, but it had one fatal flaw that was killing American pilots weekly. It couldn't turn with a Zero. The Japanese fighter was lighter, more agile, could complete a full horizontal turn in nearly half the time a Wildcat needed. In dogfights, that difference meant death. American doctrine was clear. Wildcats should never engage Zeros in turning fights. Use speed, use diving attacks, hit and run. Don't get caught in horizontal maneuvers. But doctrine didn't account for reality. Japanese pilots were too experienced. They forced American pilots into turns, cut inside their turning radius, got behind them, shut them down. McCrae had watched 17 pilots die in the past 3 months. Good men, skilled pilots. They'd followed doctrine perfectly. It hadn't saved them. The problem wasn't pilot error, it was ammunition distribution. Standard ammunition loading for a Wildcat's .650 caliber machine guns was mixed. Ball rounds for penetration, armor-piercing for hardened targets, incendiary for fuel tanks, tracer rounds for visual reference. The mixture was balanced, effective against multiple target types, but it was wrong for the Pacific theater. Japanese aircraft were lightly built. Zeros had minimal armor protection. Their fuel tanks weren't self-sealing. They didn't need armor-piercing rounds to penetrate. They needed fire, lots of fire. Fast ignition, immediate, catastrophic damage. But standard ammunition loading included only 20% incendiary rounds. 80% of every burst was wasted on ammunition types that wouldn't ignite Japanese aircraft quickly enough. McCrae had mentioned this to the ordnance officer 6 weeks ago. The officer said ammunition loading was determined by theater command, standardized across all Pacific units, no individual modifications authorized. Besides, changing ammunition ratios would require approval from the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington. That would take months, maybe years. So McCrae did something that violated every regulation in the Army Air Force Armament Manual. He started loading Walsh's guns with 90% incendiary rounds, 10% tracers for targeting reference, no ball rounds, no armor piercing, pure fire. The modification took 40 minutes per aircraft. McCrae had to remove all standard ammunition belts, separate the rounds by type, reassemble the belts with custom loading patterns. The work was tedious, precise. One mistake in the belt sequence could cause gun jams that would get Walsh killed. Nobody noticed. The ground crew was focused on engine maintenance and fuel loading. The pilots were in briefings. The ordnance inspector checked ammunition quantities, not composition. McCrae worked alone in the pre-dawn darkness, rebuilding ammunition belts by the light of a single work lamp. Walsh took off at 11:47 hours. McCrae watched the Wildcat climb into the equatorial sky, join formation with 11 other fighters, and head northwest toward Japanese-controlled airspace. Then all he could do was wait. The engagement began at 12:03 hours. Walsh's division of 4 Wildcats intercepted 16 Zeros at 8,000 feet over the Russell Islands. The morning sun was directly overhead. No altitude advantage for either side. A fair fight, which meant the Americans were in trouble. Walsh was flying number 2 position when his division leader called out the enemy formation. They rolled into attack formation. Walsh picked a Zero at the edge of the Japanese formation, dove toward it, built speed. The Zero pilot saw him coming, began a defensive turn. Standard doctrine said Walsh should continue his dive, build more speed, avoid the turning fight. But the Zero was alone, separated from its formation. If Walsh could destroy it quickly before the other Zeros arrived, he'd eliminate one threat and still have time to escape. He made a decision that should have killed him. He pulled hard, followed the Zero into its turn. The Japanese pilot immediately recognized his advantage. The Zero could outturn the Wildcat easily. The Zero tightened his turn, forced Walsh to follow an impossible flight path. The Zero was cutting inside Walsh's turning radius. In 30 seconds, it would be behind him. Walsh would be dead. But something happened that neither pilot expected. Walsh got his guns on target first. The Wildcat's heavier weight gave it more momentum in the turn. It couldn't turn as tight as the Zero, but it maintained speed better through the maneuver. Walsh pulled lead, aimed where the Zero would be, and pressed the trigger. 6 50-caliber machine guns fired. Normal ammunition would have required a sustained burst, maybe 3 seconds of fire to guarantee destruction. Walsh's modified ammunition needed less than 1 second. The incendiary rounds struck the Zero's wing root. The aircraft exploded immediately. Not just engine fire or wing damage, complete structural failure. The Zero came apart in mid-air. Walsh had never seen anything like this. Japanese aircraft usually absorbed significant damage before going down. This Zero had disintegrated from a single brief burst. The destruction was so immediate, so catastrophic, that the other Japanese pilots hesitated. They'd expected a long turning fight.
Hope you guys enjoyed this video.
Instead,
if you like more
they'd watch their wingmen
check my
simply
main channel
explode.
as well, where you can find in-depth
That
videos
hesitation
about historical
cost them.
weapons, vehicles, and
Walsh's
events.
division
See
leader
the
and
link in the
wingmen arrived.
description.
4 Wildcats engaged 15 Zeros. The Americans were still outnumbered, still at a disadvantage. But they had one weapon the Japanese didn't expect: fire. In the next 8 minutes, Walsh shot down 3 more Zeros. Each kill required the same pattern: brief contact, 1-second burst, immediate explosion. The Japanese aircraft weren't just shot down, they were incinerated. The psychological impact on the remaining Zero pilots was devastating. By 12 hours, the Japanese formation had scattered. 9 Zeros destroyed, 6 fled. 4 Wildcats survived with minor damage. The kill ratio was unprecedented. American pilots in the Pacific had never achieved anything close to 9-0 against experienced Japanese pilots. Walsh landed at Henderson Field at 12:41 hours. McCrae was waiting on the flight line. Walsh shut down his engine, climbed out of the cockpit. His hands were shaking. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. He walked directly to McCrae.
Walsh said 4 words. "What did you do?" McCrae explained the ammunition modification, the increased incendiary ratio, the elimination of armor-piercing and ball rounds, the focus on ignition rather than penetration. Walsh listened without interruption. When McCrae finished, Walsh asked if he could do the same modification to every Wildcat in the squadron. McCrae said yes, but Walsh needed to understand the risks. The modification was unauthorized. If command discovered it, both of them would face court-martial, possibly prison. But if it worked, American pilots might stop dying. Walsh said he didn't care about regulations. He'd lost 4 wingmen in the past month, all shot down in turning fights they couldn't win. If there was something that could help them survive, he wanted it. That evening, McCrae modified the ammunition loading for 12 Wildcats. Same pattern, 90% incendiary, 10% tracer. The work took 8 hours. He finished at 0347 hours, cleaned up his tools, went to his bunk for 3 hours of sleep. The next morning, Walsh's squadron encountered 18 Zeros over Bougainville. Standard doctrine said they should avoid engagement. 12 Wildcats against 18 Zeros was suicide. But Walsh's pilots had something different now. They had ammunition that could kill Japanese aircraft instantly. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. When it ended, 11 Zeros had been destroyed. 0 American losses. The kill ratio was impossible. American fighters in the Pacific had never achieved anything close to that level of success against experienced Japanese opposition. Word spread through Henderson Field within hours. Pilots from other squadrons wanted to know what had changed. Some suspected new tactics. Others thought it was pilot skill improvement. Nobody considered ammunition modification because nobody knew McCrae had done it. Captain Robert Chen was a squadron leader with the 67th Fighter Squadron. He heard about Walsh's success from a pilot who'd witnessed the engagement. Chen was skeptical until he saw the gun camera footage. Japanese aircraft exploding from single short bursts. Complete destruction in less than 1 second. Chen had been flying combat for 18 months. He'd never seen Zeros die that quickly. Chen found McCrae in the armament area 2 days later. McCrae was loading standard ammunition into a different squadron's aircraft. Chen asked him directly if anything had been changed about Walsh's ammunition. McCrae looked at him for a long moment, then told him about the incendiary modification. Chen asked if McCrae could do the same thing for his squadron. McCrae said yes, but Chen had to understand the consequences. The modification violated multiple regulations. If discovered, everyone involved would face charges. But it was working. Pilots were surviving who would otherwise be dead. Chen said he'd lost 6 pilots in his squadron in the past 2 months, all shot down by Zeros in turning fights they couldn't win. If there was something that could change those odds, he wanted it. By September 25th, McCrae had modified ammunition for 37 Wildcats across 3 squadrons. The work was exhausting. He slept 4 hours a night, spent the rest of his time rebuilding ammunition belts. His hands were constantly stained with cordite residue. His fingers ached from handling thousands of individual rounds. But the results were undeniable. Wildcat squadrons using modified ammunition were achieving kill ratios between 6-to-1 and 10-to-1 against Japanese fighters. Squadrons using standard ammunition were still losing aircraft at previous rates. The Japanese noticed first. Flight reports from the 11th Air Fleet began mentioning American ammunition that caused instantaneous explosive destruction of Japanese aircraft. Pilots reported that American fighters were suddenly much more dangerous. Single short bursts were destroying aircraft that should have required sustained fire. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai was Japan's leading ace in the South Pacific, 64 confirmed victories. On September 28th, Sakai engaged a division of Wildcats over the Russell Islands. He used standard tactics, drew the Americans into a turning fight, got behind the trailing Wildcat, opened fire at close range. The American pilot rolled hard right, reverse direction. Sakai followed. The Wildcat couldn't outturn his Zero. Sakai had executed this maneuver dozens of times. He knew the timing perfectly. In 6 seconds, he'd have a clean shot.
But the Wildcat pilot did something unexpected. Instead of continuing his defensive turn, he reversed again, rolled back toward Sakai. The maneuver was aggressive, almost suicidal. The American was offering Sakai a head-on shot, but it also gave the American pilot the same opportunity. Both pilots fired simultaneously. Sakai's rounds struck the Wildcat's engine cowling. The American's rounds hit Sakai's wing root. Under normal circumstances, both aircraft should have survived with damage. Neither pilot had sustained fire on target. The Wildcat's engine caught fire but continued running. The aircraft was damaged but flyable. Sakai Zero exploded. Complete structural failure. The aircraft disintegrated around him. Sakai barely escaped in his parachute. He'd never experienced anything like it. A brief burst from American guns had caused catastrophic destruction that should have required much more damage. Something had changed about American ammunition. It was more dangerous than anything he'd encountered in 3 years of combat. Sakai returned to base, confused and shaken. He reported the incident to his squadron commander. Other experienced Japanese pilots had similar stories. American fighters were suddenly causing more destruction with less ammunition. tactics that had worked reliably for months were suddenly failing. Japanese intelligence tried to determine what had changed. They examined wreckage from American aircraft, found no obvious modifications. The guns were identical. The aircraft were the same. Nothing visible had changed. What they didn't know was that the change was hidden in the ammunition belts, rounds that looked identical to standard ammunition but had completely different effects. By October, Japanese pilots were losing aircraft to Wildcats at rates they hadn't seen since early in the war. The psychological impact was significant. 0 pilots had owned the sky in turning fights for 2 years. That confidence was breaking down. Meanwhile, McCrae's modification was spreading through the American fighter community. Pilots told other pilots. Mechanics told other mechanics. No official documentation, no engineering approval, just whispered conversations in ready rooms and maintenance areas. By November, maybe 60 Wildcats in the South Pacific had modified ammunition. The kill ratio statistics were impossible to ignore. Fighter squadrons using the modification were achieving unprecedented success against Japanese opposition. Then the ordnance officer at Henderson Field noticed something unusual. Ammunition consumption rates had changed. Squadrons were using more incendiary rounds than their allocation allowed. Standard mixed ammunition contained 20% incendiary, but these squadrons were burning through incendiary stocks 4 times faster than expected. The officer investigated, found McCrae rebuilding ammunition belts, asked what he was doing. McCrae told him about the modification, the increased incendiary ratio, the elimination of armor-piercing rounds, and the focus on immediate ignition. The ordnance officer should have arrested McCrae immediately. The modification violated multiple regulations. It was unauthorized tampering with military equipment. It could result in court-martial for everyone involved. Instead, the officer asked for kill ratio statistics. McCrae showed him the squadron records. Wildcats using modified ammunition, average kill ratio 8-to-1. Wildcats using standard ammunition, average kill ratio 2-to-1. The numbers were undeniable. The officer made a decision that saved American lives. He didn't report the modification. He quietly authorized increased incendiary ammunition allocation for squadrons that required it. No questions asked, no official documentation. Just an unofficial policy change that let McCrae continue his work. The modification never became official during the war. The Bureau of Ordnance learned about it in December 1943 when an ammunition inspector noticed irregular loading patterns. He wrote a report, sent it to Washington. The report sat on desks for months while officials debated what to do. The modification worked. Fighter squadrons using it had significantly better survival rates, but it violated established procedures. The question wasn't whether the modification helped. The question was whether to punish the mechanics who'd done it without authorization or quietly approve it after the fact. In March 1944, the Bureau of Ordnance issued new ammunition loading standards for Pacific theater operations. Incendiary rounds, 60%. Tracer rounds, 20%. Ball rounds, 20%. No armor-piercing rounds against Japanese aircraft. The new standard was similar to McCrae's, but not identical. McCrae never received official credit. No commendation, no medal, no mention in any report. The official documentation attributed the ammunition improvement to analysis of combat effectiveness data. The McCrae's name didn't appear anywhere. Walsh survived the war. He flew 127 combat missions, shot down 19 Japanese aircraft, and returned to California in 1945. He became a commercial pilot, flew for United Airlines for 32 years. Every year, on September 14th, Walsh called McCrae to thank him for saving his life. Chen also survived. He led his squadron through the Philippines campaign, shot down 23 aircraft. After the war, he stayed in the Air Force and retired as a colonel in 1968. He told the story of McCrae's modification to every ordnance officer he supervised. McCrae stayed in the Army Air Force until 1946, returned to Tennessee, went back to working on cars. He opened his own garage in Memphis in 1949. He worked on engines for 37 years. Never talked much about the war. When people asked, he'd say he loaded ammunition. That's all. In 1987, a military historian researching Wildcat tactics found references to ammunition modifications in squadron records from Guadalcanal. The historian tracked down McCrae through veteran registries. McCrae was 71 years old, still working part-time in his garage. The historian asked him about the modification. McCrae confirmed the story, said it wasn't anything special, just something that needed doing. The historian estimated that the modification may have saved between 40 and 60 American pilot lives based on survival rate improvements in squadrons that used it. McCrae said he never counted. He just remembered the pilots who came back. Walsh, Chen, the others. That was enough. Billy McCrae died in 2003 at age 87. He was buried in Memphis National Cemetery. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic. It did not mention the ammunition modification. Did not mention that he'd changed how American fighters fought. Did not mention that he'd broken regulations to save lives. His garage in Memphis is gone now, torn down in 2010 for a shopping center. But somewhere in storage there's a faded photograph, a young mechanic in coveralls standing beside a Wildcat. The date written on the back is September 1943, Guadalcanal. That's how innovation happens in war, not through committees or official channels, through mechanics who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives.